Hello history fans, and welcome to the podcast that helps you learn a little bit of history. Today I want to talk about the history of witches, with a main focus on two eras. We'll start with the Romans, of course, as you might expect from me, and then the more famous witch trials that came under James I. Now, in the Roman world, these typically women were more known as practitioners of magic, as witches didn't come about until the Middle Ages. Witches, I mean, as they didn't ride broomsticks in antiquity like they do in films nowadays. They're just women who have been connected to magical acts involving spells and sorcery and potions. They're sort of respected but distrusted, and employed by the elite as a powerful weapon, despite living on the sidelines of society. In the ancient world, there's a division of feelings about witchcraft between the Greeks and the Romans, as well as the elite and non-elite. In Greek literature, they're often young, beautiful goddesses like Circe in the Odyssey, who manages to seduce Odysseus into staying on her island, despite the fact she's just turned his men into pigs. Roman sources have a mixture of opinions, as expected, because they use the Greek literary traditions, but also folklore, and they incorporate the general Roman suspicions of women. They seem more concerned about witchcraft than the Greeks were. But there's not loads of sources and stories. The sources we do have call witches strega, which translates to witch, but that word turns up rarely, it's not common. What's more common is winifica, which means poisoner, and it overlaps with the magical arts and witchcraft. So from the start, terminology is difficult or unclear maybe, but we're referencing similar things, so we get the general concept. Maybe witchcraft was a concept to the Roman historians that they didn't understand. It's a combination of religion, medicine and rituals, so they see the magical practices as an inversion of religion. Like religious sacrifices, witches use body parts, but it's not to honour the gods, it's for malevolent reasons, for unknown dark purposes. Medicine also overlaps a lot with poison and making potions, which is quite a common overlap for the Romans. They thought medical knowledge in the wrong hands was used to cause harm, especially if it's a sneaky, pesky, power-hungry woman, of course. For the Romans, the intent behind the magic was a huge part, and witches were using it for their own benefit or to harm someone else. The earliest depiction of a witch we have comes from the Roman poet Horace. He tells us of two sorceresses with pale skin, long nails and wild hair, which is a contrast to the Greek witches. And it's similar to what you might picture from modern cartoons, maybe. They're burying a wolf's head under the full moon to conjure up the dead. We also have Pharsalia by Lucan, which is Latin literature that shows a witch who murders people and terrorises their spirits. Latin sources show women engaging in necromancy, and some were even believed to be shapeshifters. So we do have Latin literature describing witches to us. The earliest mention from Roman times that's been interpreted as being about magic that's not a work of literature comes from the 12 Tables. Now, the 12 Tables were the earliest Roman laws that we don't have any originals of course, because they were put together in about 450 BCE, it's believed. But we know about them because people continuously write about them, and they've been reconstructed using those sources. So, we know that casting spells which harm crops, cattle or people were prohibited, and witchcraft was a capital crime that could get you burnt alive. Pliny the Elder is our source for writing about the tablets mentioning magic. He relates malicious intent to the magic. In the laws themselves of the 12 Tables, do we not read the following words? Whosoever shall have bewitched the harvest. And he also references something else, saying, who shall ever have cast an evil spell? Thus showing us that these Roman laws must have had something to do with magic, whilst also showing us the Romans' views on magic. By the language of, bewitching an evil spell, they clearly think witchcraft is only a bad and evil thing. If you want to read his specific way of phrasing it, as I think I've just paraphrased it from my research, it's from Pliny's Natural History, book 28, chapter 28. His partial quoting of the tablets in his work suggests the law may have even been about a spell that meant your neighbour's harvest would be unsuccessful, which is a very specific example of a spell. The word he uses is malum carmen, meaning evil spell, but carmen means song or poem, so some people think it doesn't exactly mean magic, but some sort of incantation maybe. Either way, he clearly linked magic and laws, so by the late Republic or early Empire, there's a clear link between magic and evil behaviours being illegal. We'll of course never know if the tablets actually meant or intended to do that, or if it's just the later Romans relating their now opinions back to them, once they've now decided that magic is evil and illegal. Either way, we know their opinion on the witches now. He also talks about some things that would be considered malevolent acts of magic. There is indeed nobody who does not fear to be spellbound by implications. A similar feeling makes everybody break the shells of eggs or snails immediately after eating them, or else pierce them with the spoon that they were eating them with. And so Theocritus amongst the Greeks, Catullus, and quite recently Virgil amongst ourselves have represented love charms in their poems. Many believe that by charms poetry can be crushed, and not a few blah 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 blah. I can't remember the end of the quote, it's a very long quote, but one clearly telling us about magic and spells and charms. Being spellbound in particular comes up again when discussing other various different spells, but mostly in relation to using spells to get someone to do as you wish, and using charms to bind that person to you. Again, very specific ideas of magic. Virgil, who he referred to earlier, was a Roman poet whose Echelon mentions a woman who uses drugs and herbs to bring back her dead lover. The herbs came from Pontus, which was an area on the shores of the Black Sea that the Romans considered heavily in association with magic. It was the area of Greece that witches were expected to come from, and Virgil's story shows that the Romans thought witches used poison to bring back spirits from the dead, and that witches could even turn men into wolves. So our ancient historians obviously believe that magic happens, and that they know where it all comes from. But there's not just literary stories and historical accounts like that, there's actual cases of persecutions too. There's a few cases from the imperial period, with Pliny telling us that the Romans began the first witch hunts in the period. But there is a significant law passed in the late Republic that causes more persecutions. The Cornelian law of assassins and magical poisonings, or Lex Cornelia de Sicari Vinifica, was passed in 81 BCE under the name of Cornelius Sulla, which meant that the subsequent persecutions made in regards to magic were a lot easier. This also made the magical interpretations of the 12 tablets I spoke about earlier more concrete. They could use that in their persecution of the witches. In the 2nd century BCE, there's an unsuccessful prosecution of a farmer whose harvest had done well, but his neighbours claimed he had charmed their crops through Vinifica. Interestingly, this is a man being accused of poisoning magic, and Livy is our source for this, or Titus Livius if you know him that way. He was one of the 3 main Roman historians. Anyway, the farmer just has his workers come to the court and testify about how hard they worked, which won him the case and he wasn't persecuted. But this is before the new law, so maybe that's why the farmer was okay. You know, it wasn't the fact that his workers were like, no, we worked hard. Come on, neighbours, just because you clearly are bad at farming. Anyway, despite the tale of the farmer, magic was more commonly tied to women because of Roman misogyny and fear of powerful women who dare to step out of their prescribed roles. How dare they? We then have a case from Livy in the 4th century, which is a mass poisoning trial involving a conspiracy that elite women had tried to murder their husbands, and because they're of elite social status, it's a huge threat and concerned the state. Supposedly, 170 women were a part of this conspiracy, but did it actually happen, or was there just mass panic and worry that these women would try to gain power by freeing themselves from marriage to these probably horrible men? Livy often tells of women rising up and stepping outside their roles, and he compares it to the laws as being a bad thing. He doesn't support the women, which, I mean, if you want to free yourself from a bad marriage, free yourself, girl, but don't get accused of witchcraft in the meantime. However, the imperial period does have more comprehensive records of women being put on trial, and the men then employing them. There's two famous cases. So Winifecum was apparently involved in the death of Germanicus in 90 CE. Because he died under such mysterious circumstances, questions were raised. He was the great hope for the future, the emperor's heir, a young soldier, but we've spoken about him before on this channel, so you know all about him. Of course, at the time, people were dying of food poisonings or infections that the Romans just didn't understand. So it's possible that that's what did happen, but there's no obvious manoeuvring of anyone in the imperial court or any obvious manipulation of things by people in power, which apparently makes his death even more suspicious, you know, apart from Tiberius just being a dodgy emperor in general. Tacitus's Annals, Book 2, Chapter 69 tells us. Bear with, let me just find... Bear with. Can't find it. I'm struggling to find the actual quote because in my version, the bit about Germanicus is all in Chapter 5, not Book 2, Chapter 69. So I don't know where I've got that book and chapter from because it's not there in my version. But in summary, what Tacitus tells us is that I think it's where Germanicus died. The floor and the walls were, they looked like human bodies. I think actually it might be in his home because they found supposedly spells and curses like lead tablets engraved with the name Germanicus. There were half-burnt ashes with blood smeared and other supposed magic. I'm not really explaining that very well, but basically it was believed that he was just magicked away. So yeah, it's believed he's just been magicked away and he can't have just been poisoned and died because there's so many spooky supernatural things going on according to what was found when he died. Human body parts in a wall has malicious intent. Humans have been sacrificed for the process of killing Germanicus. Maleficent evil witchcraft is definitely going on here. We do have someone to blame for Germanicus's death though, which if you've seen my Caligula episode, you'll know was a man named Piso. Now the case against him was based on him using poison to kill Germanicus, which he got from a famous poisoner, or Winifeca, meaning magical poisoner, called Martina, who happened to be a friend of his wife. He was brought to trial for being a man in a circle of dangerous women. He commits suicide, but there's of course suggestions that he was got rid of. Did he know too much or expose too much about these women with his slip-up? His wife, however, was a friend of Livia, Augustus's wife, so she wasn't found guilty. Martina was sent to Rome to be tried, but she suddenly died. It said she had poison hidden in her hair knot. Had she used it to escape conviction, or did she keep it on her in order to escape should something happen, or to use it on someone else? And she died before being able to use it. But Tacitus makes Tiberius the guilty one in the story, which I think makes more sense. And our second famous Roman witch trial is Locusta of Gaul. She was eventually arrested and found guilty of murder by poisoning, being associated with Agrippina the Younger, Nero's mother, as she gave her the poison to kill Emperor Claudius, who had somehow survived the other poisoners Agrippina had used, which meant she required this skilled magical practitioner's help. With this story, again, the fear of women wanting power is apparent, because Agrippina uses the magic to get rid of her husband so her son can take over, supposedly. Tacitus's Annals, chapter 66, gives us a description of Locusta as a skilled artist with ingenuity that devises this special potion. Oh yeah, okay, so Agrippina had long decided on murder. Now she saw her opportunity. Her agents were ready, but she needed advice about poisons. A sudden drastic effect would give her away. A gradual wasting recipe might make Claudius, confronted with death, love his son again. What was needed was something subtle that would upset the emperor's faculties, but produce a deferred fatal effect. An expert in such matters was selected, a woman called Locusta, recently sentenced for poisoning, but with a long career of imperial service ahead of her. By her talents a preparation was supplied. It was administered by the eunuch Helotus, who habitually served the emperor and tasted his food. Later the whole story became known. Contemporary writers stated that the poison was sprinkled on a particularly succulent mushroom. Locusta is then kept on by Nero when he is emperor, who knows her skills and understands the need to have her on his side. She poisons the people he wants to get rid of, and Nero even entrusts her with the killing of Britannicus, and she's even called an arch-poisoner. At this point she's sort of the witch of the imperial palace, but she is afraid of the law, and she avoids poisoning people obviously. She's slow and sneaky, which actually earns her a beating from Nero when she doesn't instantly get rid of Britannicus. It is an art, she's doing it subtly and can make it look like an illness. In the ancient world, there is a reluctant respect for these types of skills and the knowledge required for this level of expertise. And she's given a country estate by Nero and students, which suggests that the emperor wants this whole backup team of witches and potion makers at the ready. It's clearly a bizarrely precarious lifestyle or area of work to be in. You could be put on trial and killed, or you could be well rewarded by the emperor himself. That's under Nero though. We continue to have poisonings after, of course, that the Romans assume are the cause of Nero's witch, who is punished after his death, along with the rest of his entourage. Emperor Galba, the following emperor, has her paraded through Rome in chains, and then she's executed like foreign captives. It's Cassius Dio who tells us that Locusta is branded as one of Nero's entourage, treated as a captive from triumph in war, paraded and executed. His account suggests as a magical practitioner she was seen as a foreigner outside of society, which is in fitting to how the contemporary Romans felt. Winifica live on the outside of society. They're there to do harm and answer to malevolent rulers. Their magical practice is dangerous and they needed to be got rid of. It's risky business if the person in power doesn't have a use for you. He'll use all those other things against you, and you're vulnerable and could be killed, despite the fact that healers were helpful in the little villages. There were also artefacts that show ancient Roman witchcraft, like over here in Roman Britain, curse tablets were quite common, and you can see a lot of them in the Roman baths in Bath. These curse tablets were used to harm victims or sometimes cure people. It's believed you would buy them from women who could be interpreted as witches. But more commonly, a witch was someone who made potions and poisons or even perfumes. As I mentioned before, the Roman fear of a witch comes from men fearing women who step out of line, and that misogyny plays a huge part in the depiction of witches. The classical authors are male, and there is a big fear of these women being used to justify the patriarchy sometimes. It's thought that a lot of people wouldn't have regarded these women as evil. Their knowledge of herbs and potions in the use of white magic was helpful, and people needed their help. They were sometimes respected members of their community as great healers who helped other women and the poor, referred to as wise women by the elite Romans writing about them. So, the evil depictions, I think, come from the wrong side of history, and the healers were really important to communities. And 1,000 years later, not much changes. Witches are still feared, but respected at the same time. It's such an odd combination. Well, actually, no, it's not. It's the depictions of black and white magic, I suppose, isn't it? Evil or healer, poison or medicine. The first English law relating to witchcraft wasn't introduced until Henry VIII's reign in 1542, when the Witchcraft Act was passed, defining witchcraft as a crime punishable by death. It was repealed 5 years later, but then restored with a new version in 1562, with James I adding on further laws in 1604. But there were definitely trials beforehand, and a huge number of witches were executed before any laws were passed. Like the trial of Eleanor Cobham, the Duchess of Gloucester, happened in 1441, where she confessed to obtaining potions from Marjorie Jourdamain, the Witch of Eye, to help her conceive, so she was found guilty of using witchcraft. In 1486, Malleus Maleficarum, or The Hammer of Witches, was published, which spurred on witch mania massively. The book was a guide on how to identify, hunt and interrogate witches. It said witchcraft was heresy and was quickly used by Christians to get rid of the supposed witches who lived among them. For over 100 years, the book sold more copies than any other book in Europe besides the Bible, which explains the estimated 60,000 murders for witchcraft from 1400 to 1700, but I think the number's bigger than that. Some people say 80,000. But it's not until James I comes in that the trials start in their huge numbers. As King of Scotland before England, he had already encouraged witchcraft trials over there before bringing them here. His inspiration, or motive rather, was the Copenhagen trials. He was travelling to Denmark in 1590 to collect his new wife, Anne of Denmark, when a horrid storm hit his fleet, and the authorities decided that a coven of witches had of course sent a curse. So there's a series of witch hunts, trials and executions of these supposed witches. James stayed there for 6 months, and it has a huge impact on him learning about witch hunting. When he comes back to Scotland, he has a coven of witches accused of working with the Danish ones on that storm, which is the start of the witch trials there in 1590, which lasted 3 years and had about 100 people executed. James took it all very personally and acted as the interrogator in most cases. Possibly the most famous of the cases was Agnes Sampson, who was one of the accused witches, reputed to have whispered into James's ear the words that his bride said to him on their wedding night. He even anonymously published a book about the trials called News from Scotland. During the 1590s, there's also apparently satanic plots against the king. There's the Bothwell plot in 1593, which was a power play between James and his cousin, where Bothwell was repeatedly accused of witchcraft, being accused of involvement in the trials of 1590. And in 1600, the Gowrie plot saw James being lured away from the hunt by the Earl of Rutherford into a small tower where he was told he would be shown treasure, but an assassin appears. James fights him off and pins him to the ground, and when he's pinned to the ground, there's demonic ciphers all over their body, which I think are like magic formulas. But no one really got to the bottom of that story. It's just a big conspiracy of trying to use magic against the king, which I think probably stems from James just being so paranoid and taking all this supposed witchcraft personally. In 1597, he wrote the book Demonology, explaining how people should go about witch hunting, how to identify a witch, and what precautions to take, that kind of necessary thing. So his second book, the king has written about witches. He's clearly very involved and passionate about the punishment for magic and working with the devil, which are clearly things these poor women and sometimes men are doing. The events can never be explained by something else. A year after becoming King of England, James passed an act against conjuring, witchcraft and dealing with evil and wicked spirits. In passing this law, it meant that it was punishable by death to bring down a person of the king using witchcraft. His changes to the English Witchcraft Act caused a lot of fear across the country. He even supervised the torture of some witches. One method used at this time was to tie the person's left thumb to their right toe and throw them into a body of water. If they floated, they're guilty, and if they sink, they're innocent, so they could avoid the accusation of witchcraft, but they'd be dead anyway. And hanging was actually more common than burning alive. At this point as well, James is really pushing the new Christian fear and theories that witches don't act alone and that they sign pacts with the devil. So if one witch was found within a village, the people thought that there had to be more within the locality, so more people were tortured in order to extract confessions and to get the names of other poor innocent women who the people could accuse of witchcraft and get killed as well. And it just, I guess it's sort of like a spiralling effect that all these, the Malleus Maleficarum, demonology, Christian theories, and just mass hysteria and fear is just leading to the death of so many innocent people. In 1612, we have the Pendle witch trials, which is one of the most famous of these witch trials, where 12 witches were charged with murdering 10 people using witchcraft. Pendle Hill in Lancashire has always been known for its association with witches, so the outcome of the trials seems fitting. One died in custody, one was found not guilty, and the other 10 were hanged. The word is hanged. They are well-known trials because of its official publication in The Wonderful Discovery of Witches in the County of Lancaster by Thomas Potts, the clerk of the court the 10 guilty were tried at. It's this documentation of the story which has meant it's a well-known legend, and apparently accounted for 2% of the executions for witchcraft in England, but I'm not sure that maths is right. 6 of the 11 witches came from rival families, each headed by poverty-stricken widows. The Demdike family, or Demdike family, with Elizabeth Southerns, or Old Demdike, and the Chattox family with Anne Whittle, or Mother Chattox. Brilliant witchy family leader names, I think. Similar to the Romans, at this time, villagers were used to having healers who practiced this magic, using herbs and medicines, and it could be found fascinating, but they also, of course, ran the huge risk of being condemned and feared by the wrong people. For 50 years, Old Demdike had been known as a witch and was accepted as part of village life. But James's opinions had started to be reflected in the people, and in 1612, each justice of the peace in Lancashire was required to compile a list of people who refused to attend church. Now, why would that be relevant? The next bit of this story of how these families came to be accused of witchcraft is a long one, so I'll do my best to keep it short. Alison Device asked John Law for a pin. He refused, so she cursed him, as I'm sure anyone does when they're annoyed, you know. Ah, damn you. Anyway, soon after, John suffered a stroke and blamed Alison. The incident was brought to Justice Knoll. She confessed and said she told the devil to lame John. She then accused her grandmother, Old Demdike, and members of the Chattox family of witchcraft too. Accusing the Chattox family came out of revenge from years of feuding, said to have started when the Chattox family broke into and stole from the Demdikes' home. John Device, Alison's father, also blamed the illness that led to his death on Old Chattox, who had threatened to harm his family if they didn't pay yearly for their protection. The Chattox were also blamed for the death of 4 other villagers, while James Demdike also said Alison had cursed a child, and Elizabeth, Alison's daughter, I believe, said her mother had marks on her body where the devil had sucked her blood, leaving her mad. Old Demdike and Chattox then confessed to selling their souls, and Anne Chattox was seen making clay figures. So yeah, Pendle witch trials, very important because they're so well documented, and a big family feud, which is crazy. They all accused each other. The Pendle witch trials just sounds like a horrible, horrible time for those families, turning each other in. But also the fact that she said her mother had gone mad. Does that not explain what's happening? You would confess if you were that under that much pressure and torture and that distressed, wouldn't you? Because of imperialism, English witchcraft laws also applied to other countries too, and we have the famous North American witch trials. The most famous being Massachusetts in 1692, when the very tense atmosphere after a smallpox epidemic, wars between Britain and France, and fear of attack from neighbouring Native American tribes meant a scapegoat was needed so badly. The Salem witch trials started when 9-year-old and 11-year-old Elizabeth Parris and Abigail Williams began suffering fits, contortions, and uncontrolled screaming. We now think they were poisoned by a fungus that caused delusions and spasms, but as more and more young women began showing these symptoms, hysteria ensued, and 3 women were accused of witchcraft. Sarah Good, Sarah Osborne, and Tituba, a slave of Elizabeth's father, were the accused, with Tituba confessing and accusing others of using black magic too. On the 10th of June, we have the first accused witch, Bridget Bishop, being put to death in the Salem gallows, and by the end, 150 were accused of witchcraft. 18 women were put to death, and 6 men too. Other American states were consumed by witchcraft hysteria too. In Connecticut in 1647, All's Young was the first in America to be executed for witchcraft, and in the next 50 years, 11 were killed in that state. Whereas in 1655 in Virginia, a law was passed making it a crime to falsely accuse someone of witchcraft. Well done, Virginia. Rewinding 40 years though, back to England, accusations and fear was rising. Typically poor older women were being accused, and good luck if you had a cat, because they were considered familiars. But the trials hit their most intense period in the 1650s with the Puritan era, and with fear sweeping the nation, a new career was created. Witch hunters. The most famous of whom? The most famous of which? was Matthew Hopkins, the Witchfinder General. Towns would pay him huge sums to bring all witches in the area to trial. In just one day in Chelmsford, he ordered 19 suspected witches to be hung. He focused his witch-finding on finding the devil's mark on the suspect's body. Most things he would find a way to claim were the sign that they were the witch, but some specifics include finding a mole or a flea bite or a birthmark. To prove it, he would prick the area with a needle, and if they felt no pain, it was proof that they were guilty of being a witch. But it was a fake retracting needle, so it would be painless anyway. He's a slimy, horrible person. The last confirmed execution for witchcraft in England was in 1682, but fear still lingered, and there's instances of mobs attacking suspected witches. In 1716, Mary Hicks was executed for witchcraft, but confusingly, Jane Wenham was the last to be on trial for witchcraft in 1712. All we know for sure is the Witchcraft Act of 1735 finally ended persecutions of alleged witchcraft under English law. These trials and executions caused the death of so many innocent people, and while I love the folklore stories and silly Halloween films that we have now, it's important to remember that these stories come from a truly awful and terrible time in history. The fear these innocent people must have felt when they were just trying to heal or cure people is unfathomable, and the fact that people confessed to witchcraft, which must have just been delusions or madness or fear, is really very, very sad. And with that being said, that's a very short summary of witchcraft through history, specifically Romans and 1600s. I hope you've enjoyed this podcast episode. If you are listening, please do give it a little 5-star rating and download it to listen on the go. If you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe. Thank you so much for listening to the witchy special of spooky season. I'll see you next week. Bye!